Okay, welcome to this second presentation on AC 3.2. In this one, I'm going to be looking at how environmental design helps agencies to achieve social control. So often questions on this, so let's dive in. So this assessment component is looking at how a range of different agencies achieve social control, and in this one, as I said, we're looking at environmental design. And what we mean by this is the way that architects, planners and councils attempt to design the environment of an area to reduce crime, reduce instances of crime. So some criminologists argue that the actual built environment can affect crime in two ways. Firstly, by influencing potential offenders, i.e. either presents them with opportunities to commit crime or it presents them not with opportunities to commit crime. You obviously want the latter. And secondly, it affects people's ability to have control over their surroundings. The more people have control over their surroundings, the more they're involved in them, the more likely they are to spot people committing crime, and therefore it's less likely for the criminal to want to commit crime in an area where they're being watched. So they argue that the agencies mentioned above can design crime out by changing the physical layout of an area. So architects, planners and councils can design crime out by changing the way an area is. So it all started with the architect Oscar Newman, who argued that some spaces are defensible whilst others are not. And he said indefensible spaces are where crime is most likely to occur, in what he called confused areas of public space. So what he means by confused is it's not sure who has responsibility for them. So he cited examples such as anonymous walkways and stairwells that belonged to no one and were observed by no one. And he did a study of high-rise blocks in New York and found that 55% of all crimes committed occurred in public spaces such as hallways, lifts, stairwells and lobbies. And he argued that this is because no one felt that they owned them. The opposite of that is defensible spaces. These are areas that have got clear boundaries, so it's obvious who has the right to be there, and on the flip side of that, obvious who doesn't have the right to be there. And Newman argues that defensible spaces are going to have a lower crime rate because of four key features. These are territoriality, where the environment encourages ownership amongst residents, the feeling that the environment, the territory is theirs, they control it. And he used the example of cul-de-sacs because they project a private image and encourage a sense of community. Secondly, he said, if you've got natural surveillance, you've got buildings where there's an easily viewed entrance lobbies, street level windows that allow residents to identify and observe people outside and identify strangers. He said that's going to reduce crime. He says if there's a safe image, building design gives the impression of a safe neighbourhood where residents look after each other. Whereas if you've got a negative image, the place looks scruffy and it's not pleasant, then the area will be targeted by offenders. And finally, fourthly, he said, you need a safe location. Neighbourhoods that are located in the middle of a wider crime-free area are insulated from the outside world by what he called a moat of safety. Now, Newman's ideas went on to inform what we now call CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design. And it's this that you need to know about for the exam. And they can cite CPTED as is specifically in a question, so make sure you understand what we mean when we're talking about CPTED. Now, crime prevention through environmental design is a theory focusing on tactically designing and making an effective use of the environment, which when you then apply it, reduces both crime and also the fear of crime. So the main objective of CPTED is to reduce and remove the opportunity for crime to occur in an environment, and promote a positive interaction with the space, the environment, by legitimate users. And there's a couple of PowerPoint YouTube clips there that you can go and have a look at, which explain that. So CPTED is preventative, it's proactive, and it's definitely not reactive. So let's delve a little deeper. So CPTED principles are all about anticipating the thought processes of a potential offender and creating an environment that discourages follow through on crime. It's got a slight link to right realist rational choice theory, the idea that criminals weigh up the pros and cons of committing a crime. And they'll think about the area where they're like to be seen, whether it's safe, whether they're more likely to be caught when deciding whether or not to commit a crime. And CPTED draws on that. So it's got the added advantage, CPTED, of creating a sense of security and well-being amongst the people that live in the area, or if it's a place of work, the employees and the tenants. So when it's put into practice, the idea is that the resulting environment, including the buildings and their surroundings, will discourage and or impede criminal behaviour, and at the same time encourage honest people, honest citizens, to keep a watchful eye out for crime. So CPTED has 4 key elements linked to Newman's ideas, and it's these 4 elements you need to know if you're going to discuss CPTED in any exam style answer. And these 4 elements are natural surveillance, natural access control, territorial reinforcement, and maintenance. I'm going to look at these in a little more detail in the next few slides. So we're going to start with natural surveillance. This is the idea that criminals don't like to be seen or recognised. So it stands to reason they're going to choose situations where they can hide and easily escape. So if you have lots of surveillance, preferably for CPTED natural surveillance, you do things like keep areas well lit, have entrances that are bright at all times, provide a clear line of sight from both inside and outside, so glass doors that you can see out, lots of windows that you can see out. Eliminate hiding spots, so CPTED doesn't like things like hedges and trees and bushes and fences and large bins which create blind spots or hiding places. CPTED instead would advocate planting low, thorny hedges around windows, because that way you don't obstruct the view out and they don't provide a comfortable place for the would-be criminal to hide. And if you can't get natural surveillance, then CPTED would advocate the use of CCTV. So you'd use that in areas where without natural sight lines, and that can then monitor public areas so that visitors know they're being watched. Because the last thing a criminal wants to see when they enter a building is their own face on a security monitor. So the result is that a potential offender will feel like they're being watched, and that the surroundings offer no easy escape routes. So when you walk into a shop and you see your face on a TV, that's there because it's automatically telling you you're being watched. If you do anything, we'll be able to recognise you. When we talk about natural access control, that's all about how criminals like to feel they're in control, but you could deny them that feeling by clearly marking the approaches to buildings and properties and channeling visitors into a defined area. So things like maze entrances, these things here in public lobbies, cut off straight line access to potential targets such as bank teller or a cashier. Tension barriers that have to be jumped or navigated around discourage criminals. So, and also curbing and landscaping such as here, direct automobile and foot traffic into controlled visible areas. They can also prevent access to an area. So if we look at things like this in this pedestrian precinct, you know, no car's going to get through there with those huge solid wooden planters there. And that's an example of CPTED, to stop access where people get in, raiding shops, taking out cash machines, that sort of thing. They're not going to be able to get to the shops to do that. And that's curbing and landscaping. And here's a really good example. This is when the Emirates Stadium was built for Arsenal. They've got this huge, great concrete Arsenal sign, but that's been done quite deliberately. There were spates of terrorists getting into cars and lorries and ploughing into crowds to kill as many people as possible. And here is where crowds would assemble to go into the stadium. And of course, no one's going to ram into them because there's a great big Arsenal sign made of concrete that stops anyone from doing that. And that's an example of SEPTED curbing and landscaping and stopping access for the would-be criminals to inflict harm on passers-by and spectators. So that leads us on to territorial reinforcement. And this is all about creating a clear distinction between what's public and what's private property. So legitimate occupants have a sense of ownership and will notice and even challenge people who don't belong. Intruders, on the other hand, have a harder time blending in. So examples of territorial reinforcement are things like making sure that a receptionist at a building or at a school has clear sight lines to all entrances, as well as the ability to quickly and discreetly call for help, have a panic button that calls a central station or signals for help via an alarm light in a separate section of the building. That's an example of SEPTED. So something like that, clear sight line to the building of who's coming in, and they've got to go a fair distance before they get to reception as well. Making sure you've got things like security signage clearly visible at all entrances. Having a visitor badge system, making sure that all visitors are properly escorted. And that results in employees gaining a feeling that this is my space, while intruders are immediately put on the defensive. If at home you've got just a little wall in your front garden which clearly defines where your house starts and where the pavement ends, that's territorial reinforcement. So anyone that steps over that wall automatically is on your property and not on public property, and you can challenge them on that. And finally, we go down to maintenance, which is again linked to right realism, particularly broken windows theory. The idea that one broken window will entice vandals to break another. Vandalised area then becomes more inviting to higher levels of crime. So property under SEPTED should be well maintained as a matter of safety as well as pride. And also target hardening is linked to that. This simply means making a building more difficult to forcibly enter. So using deadbolts, protective window films, they're all examples of target hardening. Buildings with plate glass windows are vulnerable to smash and grab burglaries, but plate glass can stop a sledgehammer when a protective film's properly installed. So that stops crime from happening. So SEPTED has really clear links to right realist theories and ideas such as rational choice theory and situational crime prevention. Okay, so just by way of does it work or doesn't it work, this lady here, Alice Coleman, adopted a similar approach to Newman in the United Kingdom. And she looked at 4,099 blocks of flats in 2 London boroughs. And she concluded that poor design of many of these blocks of flats produced higher rates of crime and antisocial behaviour. And she said there were 3 design features of these flats that encouraged crime. They encouraged anonymity, so no sense of belonging, a lack of surveillance, and easy escapes. And so she said, all you need to do are these 3 things on these blocks of flats. So she said, number 1, don't build blocks of flats because they're not conducive to SEPTED. Secondly, give each existing block its own garden or private space so that residents will look after it and they have a sense of ownership and it's obvious who should and shouldn't be in that area. And thirdly, get rid of overhead walkways. There were loads of these overhead walkways, as you can see from the photo, and they obstruct surveillance because they get in the way of sight lines, and also they provide easy escape routes for would-be criminals. And these ideas have been very influential with planners and have led to attempts to design crime out, SEPTED. So for example, on the Lisson Green estate in West London, they got rid of the overhead walkways and that led to a 50% reduction in crime. Big reduction just by getting rid of the walkways. Some police forces now employ architectural liaison officers to build in crime prevention features at the design stage for new buildings. And there's also the secured by design, the SBD kite mark scheme used by the building industry in this country, which indicates that a new building meets crime prevention standards. And there's a 30% lower burglary rate in SBD houses because they're target hardened, they're harder to break into. Now, that's accepted, but the syllabus also requires you to be able to give 2 specific examples of this. So gated lanes is one of them. And so you could get a specific question on gated lanes. Now, not so much in the south west, but where I used to live up in the northeast in Hull, in 2 up, 2 down houses, there's very common for terraced houses to be set out like this. And what you can see, if you look carefully, there are little lanes and alleys that run between all these houses, which means that, if I live here and I want to visit the person there, I can just go all the way through without having to walk all the one way round. Okay, so these alleys run along the rear of older style terrace housing in the UK. Now, many people argue that this is an issue because they're dark, they're not well lit, there's no sense of ownership, and these create a problem. They build up rubbish, people don't have a sense of ownership, and so the proposal is that actually by introducing gates to these alleys that are lockable, that will design out crime in those areas. So while normally a burglary prevention tool, alley gates can also prevent other crimes such as littering and antisocial behaviour by preventing access to alleys by non-residents and better controlling the space. This is the theory. So alley gates, gated lanes, are usually made of iron and steel. They're made bespoke in relation to the requirements and specifications of the individual alley. And the residents of the homes adjacent to the gated alley are then left to operate the gates either using keys or a key code combination. And you can have a look at that article there about how gated alleys have affected the streets in Wales, if you wish to. So how do gated lanes achieve social control? Well, the answer is they act as a physical barrier. It's difficult to climb over for the burglar or crawl under, decreases crime by increasing the effort for offenders to commit burglary and other crimes. And because the residents are responsible for the gates and controlling access to them, this increases guardianship and surveillance as well as territoriality, and therefore reduces crime. And of course, defenders can no longer use the excuse that they didn't realise that access was prohibited because the gate is locked. It decreases the idea of broken windows by gating the alleys and creating orderly and clean spaces. And at the same time, it reduces the attractiveness of the area to offenders. You have effectively target hardened. And thirdly, once the criminal does get over the fence, assuming he or she is desperate enough to do it, it actually limits the items which are possible to remove during offences. Very hard to get a 78-inch colour TV over that locked gate or through that locked gate. So there's other aspects of it as well. But, and there's always a but with all these things, some people argue that there are ways in which alley gates may actually act to increase crime, because some people argue it actually reduces guardianship. If gating the alleys reduces their usage by legitimate individuals such as residents, then they argue that actually guardianship and natural surveillance has decreased, not increased. And also, it don't work if the criminal's resident within the gated area. That's pretty obvious, actually. So in what context does it work best? Well, the neighbourhood may have an impact upon their effectiveness. So if you've got communities with a high turnover of residents, that may mean that many people have access to keys or key codes without necessarily having any investment in the area. And the reality is that if you're in these 2 up, 2 down terraced houses, particularly in areas up north. That's quite often the cheaper housing, and it's quite often used for student accommodation, where the student accommodation is quite transient, and so they don't have an ownership of the area. And also, they cost money. You know, they're about £728 per gate, so that does require the community to invest in them. So that's not necessarily a good thing. And sometimes, you know, the physical environment is important. Alley gates have to create an environment that appears, you know, if you've got these locked up gates, you don't want them to create an environment that appears to be uncared for. So, you know, you can't get your bins out. It becomes full of litter. Gates got to be really carefully designed and appropriate to the context in which they're to be installed, or actually they're not going to work for crime reduction purposes. So when we get to SEPTED, some criticisms, you know, so I mean it sounds all fantastic, and I've given you some downsides of gated lanes, but SEPTED focuses on defence from outsiders who come into the area to offend, but it's not going to deal with insiders who commit crime too, such as domestic violence, I suppose. It can't explain offences that don't involve physical intrusion into the neighbourhood, such as cybercrime, fraud, white-collar and corporate crime. Fairly obvious, that one. And of course, Newman talked about cul-de-sacs being a really good defensible space. Well, actually, they might not be defended. For example, if the residents are out all day at work, actually what you've got there is no surveillance. So this again highlights how social factors such as employment patterns can actually interact with environmental factors. And some housing estates have high crime rates, just because of councils' housing allocation policies rather than because of how they've been designed. Some councils place problem families with a history of antisocial behaviour altogether on what are called sink estates. And many years ago I used to teach in one, and it was a challenge, shall we say. And an area's reputation rather than its design can also cause a high crime rate. If police regard a specific estate as crime ridden, they'll patrol it more, leading to more arrests, a higher crime rate, and an even worse reputation. So it's like a snowball effect. So that's a possibility. So there you have some criticisms. Now, the other thing that you are expected to deal with under this AC is look at how prison design can impact on crime and social control. And here now we're talking about crime within prison and social control within prison. So we've already looked briefly at the panopticon, the all-seeing shape. This was an early prison design. Michael Foucault argues that in a modern society we're increasingly controlled by surveillance, and he illustrated this through a description of prison design known as the panopticon. So the concept of this design is to allow an observer to view all the prisoners without the prisoners being able to tell if they're being watched. So the observers sit in the guard tower where they can watch all the cells that are on the outside. And social control is achieved through this design. The building's got the tower in the centre from which the guards can see all the cells. Now, the key thing here is there's this one-way glass in front of all the cells. The prisoners can be seen by the guards, but they can't see the guards, and they can't communicate with their fellow inmates. So the prisoners don't know whether they're being watched or not at any given moment. And Foucault argues, therefore, they behave just in case. Surveillance turns into self-surveillance. The guards have no need to discipline the prisoners are disciplining themselves. So Foucault's theory now can be linked to today's use of CCTV cameras and their impact on our behaviour, and that YouTube clip looks at that. But there are other types of prison design, and prison design has evolved over the ages as technology has progressed. We don't see panopticons anymore. And also, prison design has changed due to attitudes towards how prisoners should be treated. There are designs such as the American supermax jails. These are the most secure levels of custody, so they're just designed to hold people, never let them out, never let them escape. So their objective, supermax jails, is to provide long-term segregated housing for prisoners who represent the highest security risks. those who pose threat to national and international security. So, for example, in Florence, Colorado, that Supermax prison holds some of the most notorious American terrorists and murderers. They're all held in solitary confinement. It houses 360 inmates in ultra high security, and there's a little YouTube clip you can watch there if you want. But the downside of Supermax prisons, they cost 2 or 3 times more to build and operate than a traditional maximum security prison. So that's one extreme. On the other extreme, high-tech and Supermax prisons, expensive to build, and that's why many countries continue to keep prisoners in old-style prisons such as Dartmoor Prison, for example, near Plymouth. Dartmoor Prison just closed because there's radon gas coming off the granite in Dartmoor, and they've rehoused all the prisoners, but once they've dealt with that, the prisoners will go back into Dartmoor. But Dartmoor Prison was designed and built between 1806 and 1809, and it was designed to house prisoners of war from the Napoleonic Wars, so Waterloo and Trafalgar. That's what it was designed for. It wasn't designed for our modern prison system. The newest prison is HMP Millseek in Yorkshire, and that holds a 1,500 prison, opened this year and cost £250 million to build. And I've given you 2 little YouTube clips that you can look at there. The first one looks at how the prison was built, and the second is a quick news clip on when it opened. So interestingly, documentary on how it's built is pretty good. It's 20 minutes long, well worth a watch. So the link's there should you need to look at it. And then we get to the opposite side of the Supermax. So you could have a look at Bastøy Prison in Norway. It's been called the prison that works, as well as the world's nicest prison. The Bastøy Prison inmates live communally in comfortable homes. Each man has his own room, shares the kitchen and other facilities with other inmates. A meal a day is provided for them. Any other food they have to buy from a local supermarket, and they have to prepare it themselves. And they receive an allowance of 90, it's Norway, so are they in the euro or the krona? I can't remember. Whatever that is, I think it's $90 a month, whatever. And the inmates earn roughly $8 a day on a variety of jobs that include growing food, looking after horses, repairing bicycles, doing woodwork, and maintaining the facilities. And they're given high quality education and training programs to increase their skills. It's on an island, 1 square mile in size, and there are 115 inmates with a staff of 69 employees. Only 5 guards remain on the island overnight. Only 5. And in their free time, they have an opportunity to go to church, school, library, do leisure activities such as horse riding, fishing, tennis. All the guards have received 3 years training compared to perhaps 6 months in the United States, and resemble social workers more than prison officers. And that link there from YouTube will let you see exactly what goes on at Bastøy Prison. I thoroughly recommend you having a look at that. Recidivism rates really low at Bastøy Prison, which seems to suggest that if you treat prisoners humanely, they don't reoffend. Keep them in foul conditions, they do. It's an interesting one to consider. And then finally, you can have a look at, after having a look at Bastøy Prison, you can have a look at Halden Prison in Norway, and that has been specifically designed to achieve social control. And I would thoroughly recommend looking at these 2 links. The first link looks at the design of the prison and how it's been specifically designed to control. And the second follows a reporter as they go inside and meet the guard and inmates. And they're 2 really good clips. They're not that long, well worth a watch, and will really explain that concept, the new concepts of prison design that are going on in Norway. Hopefully you find that informative, and I shall see you shortly for the final section of this AC. Take care, see you soon.